Hi there, my name is Eric, also known as Mindfield, also known as Vapor Chase on YouTube, and I want to continue my series of videos on starting out in electronic cigarettes. And in this one, I want to cover how to choose what sort of thing to start out with, because one of the most frequent questions I get from new users who have just stumbled upon my reviews on YouTube is, what would you recommend that I get? And there's no real easy answer to that, because especially for those who are new, those who haven't tried electronic cigarettes yet, or maybe have dipped their toes into the pool, because they don't really understand what they really want out of an electronic cigarette, what sort of characteristics they're looking for. I can say that to start with, the most common thing that most people seem to think that they want is something that looks, or at least comes close to as the same form factor of a real cigarette. Something like this. This is a Blaze that I had reviewed some time ago, and it is, in all respects, as close to a traditional cigarette as you're going to get. A little bit longer, perhaps, but it looks like a cigarette for the most part, and it performs like a cigarette because there's no button. You just start and inhale, and it starts to work. It even has a little light-up tip that looks like a burning ember at the end of the cigarette. And those are fine. For some people, those are perfectly fine, and they work perfectly fine. They don't really have the battery life. But this is kind of the first question you have to ask yourself, really, is, do you really want something that has the form factor of a traditional cigarette? Because if you do, then this is the sort of thing you're going to want to find wherever you can find it. There are a few like this, not necessarily exactly like this. For example, this one here, this is what we call an 808. And then we have here what we call a 510. These are both what you would call stick-style or pen-style electronic cigarettes. The only difference between these two really is, and this is what the numbers mean for the most part, is this 808 here, it has a different kind of threading. The battery has a male thread and the cartomizer has a female thread. Whereas with the 510 here, you can see the battery has a female thread while the cartomizer has a male thread. That's really the only major difference between them. Now, if you feel like this is what you're looking for, then there's a lot of different kinds of brands you can get. There are a few very common ones, things, for example, the 808 here. Kanger was the originator of the 808 style of electronic cigarette, and you can get them in a number of brands such as the Smokeless Image Volt, the Blug Max Fusion, and a few others that I can think of. Of course, you can get original Kangers as well, depending on where you go. 510s were originated by a company called Joyetech, who you may have heard of. A lot of places carry genuine Joyetech. This here is not a genuine Joyetech. This is another brand called a Torch. But it's the same idea. And both of these are manuals, so they have buttons. You can see there's buttons there on each of these. So you actually have to press a button to activate the electronic cigarette to get it to work, like this. Now, the button is just a functional thing. It's a preferential thing. However, there are some differences. For example, this automatic style, in fact, most automatic styles, they have what's called a 5-second cutoff. So if you try to take a drag for longer than 5 seconds, it will cut out. So if I try and take a 5-second or longer drag on this, it starts blinking and it turns off. And that's the problem with some of these, is you might find they're a little bit unsatisfactory in their performance, depending on the type you get, of course. And you might find you want to take a longer drag off it before you inhale it. And so something like this may not fit the bill. Whereas with most of these manuals, they usually have a 10-second cutoff, so I can take a drag for much longer than 5 seconds if I want to. And I can control how long the battery stays on. I can activate it when I want to. One of the tricks that some people do, if it's not really giving them the performance they want, and they don't want to take such a long drag, is they'll activate it for a second or two before starting to take the drag, like this. And it kind of preheats the heating element inside the cartomizer before they start taking the drag, so they can take a shorter drag. And that's one of the benefits of having a device that has a longer cutoff than 5 seconds, is you can do that and still take a long drag if you want to. Now, if you're not dead set on getting a slim device that looks more or less like a cigarette, you can move up to something like an Ego style of e-cigarette. This one here, this is an Ego T style device by a company called Beyonce, and it is similar. This one happens to be a tank system, and the tank system is sort of like, well, it's not like your cartomizer in the sense, because you can see the juice in your tank. So you can see when it's empty, and you can refill it when it needs to be, and you don't have the polyfilm material that sits inside of these cartomizers. For some people that concerns them, most people it doesn't, but there is something to be said for being able to see the liquid that you have left in your device. And of course these are larger batteries, they are fatter, and because of that they hold a longer charge. This device here is it has 280 milliamp hours. That's a kind of a technical term. What it really means, in practical terms, not to get too technical, is that on average, for the average person, a 280 milliamp hour battery, or mAh, some people may refer to it as mAh, will last the average vapor about 2.5 to 3.5 hours, depending on how much you vape. This one here is 180 milliamp hours, and it'll last about 1.5 to 2.5 hours. Whereas this one here, this Ego T style, is a 650 milliamp hour, and will last about 6 to 7 hours for most people. This one here, this is an Ego C Twist. It's 1,000 milliamp hours, so this could last, 9 to 11 hours or thereabouts. So, if you don't mind something a bit bigger, you can get longer battery life. Now, some people do prefer to take one of these and get several of them. They get a kit with 2 batteries, and then they might buy a spare battery, or 2 spare batteries for that matter, and that way they can just swap out the batteries when they need to. Something else that some people do, especially with these 808s that I referred to, they get, let's see if I can get one here, you can get what's called a personal charging case. This is one that was for the Smokeless Image Volt, and what this does is it slides open, and what you can do is take your battery, and there's a post to screw your battery on here. Let's see if we can get that out there. There you go. You just screw your battery on here, and you lie it down. You can close it, there we go, and hold the button. And it'll turn on, and it will start charging. And if you look inside, you can see the LED on the battery is lit. So this is now charging in a personal charging case. You can slip this in a pocket and go. So that's another option, is you can get a personal charging case like this, and that way when a battery runs out you can stick it in the case, have it charge, and use a second one while this one is charging. So that's something else you can do as well. I'm just going to unscrew this from here. So there's a lot of options if you really are dead set on getting a slim style, but if you really want something that's going to last you for longer periods of time before it needs to be recharged, you're going to want to look into something like an Ego type of cigarette. Here's another battery here, also a 650 milliamp hour battery. Or if you want, you can get a really long one like this for 1,000 milliamp hours. It's really up to you what you want to go with, what you feel comfortable with. Some people want to go with something like this because at a distance, if you don't look too closely, it looks like a regular cigarette and most people aren't going to question it. And some people don't really want to field questions when they're out and about and, vaping on their electronic cigarette. They don't really want to be stopped and have to explain what these things are. But some people don't mind fielding those questions. And so for those people, you can go for something a little more robust and powerful and that can hold a longer charge. And then people might ask you once in a while if they feel bold enough, and you can explain to them what it is. But it's a matter of personal choice for the most part, and the kind of performance you want to get out of your devices. There are other options. Here's, for example, this is an Ego Mini. It's a 350 milliamp hour battery. It's smaller. It's kind of in between something like this and something like this. It's the same diameter as an Ego, but about half the size. And it works the same way, except for the fact that it's just very, very short. So it fits in the pocket very nicely. Now, there are other alternatives you can go to beyond that, called mods, which are typically larger devices that have removable batteries inside, and you have to buy, you know, extra batteries to stick in there and use. I'm not really going to get into those because there are just so many different kinds of those, and what to get when it comes to a mod is really a vast matter of preference as to how it looks and what it's made of and how it performs, if it's fixed voltage or variable voltage, and that's kind of beyond the scope of a beginner series of videos, so not going to talk too much about that, other than to say that when you're ready, that is an option if you want to move up from the Egos, but perhaps I'll cover that in another video. For now, we're just going to stick to either the Slim styles or the Ego styles, because those are the two most common that most people tend to get, either starting out with it, or you might start out with this and then move up to this. I started out with something like this myself, but kind of acquired the slim ones over time. So it's up to you how you want to go, what path you want to take. What I will say is that each of them will give you a kind of an idea in a practical way how you vape, because when you're first starting out with electronic cigarettes, there's a kind of a discovery process on a personal level that will teach you a little more about you know, what kind of nicotine level you can handle and how often you vape and how much you vape, your vaping style, how you carry your devices around, what kind of devices you want to carry around with you on a daily basis, how you want to deal with those, you know, for recharging. You know, for me, for example, on a daily basis, I usually take several devices with me to work. I have spare charging cables at work. I've got a portable power bank here that I take with me that I use to charge my phone, and I can also recharge my electronic cigarettes as well on the go. And I've got, you know, power cables at work where I can charge whatever I need. And I have a few different devices because I like variety when I'm at work, you know, so I can choose what I want to do, how I want to use it, and what I want to vape. But that's going to be something you're going to discover as you get into it and as you learn more about how you vape and your personal preferences. Now, that pretty much takes care of the hardware. Now we're going to get on to the topic of e-liquid. Juices, as we tend to refer to them as. Choosing your e-liquid, I'm not going to get into flavor because flavor is, you know, highly personal and everybody is different as to what they want. I will say, however, most people assume that they want a tobacco, and perhaps more to the point, most people are going to look for a tobacco that is the same or similar to what they were smoking. And I'm going to tell you right off the bat that you're perfectly welcome to try a tobacco, of course. A lot of people have tried it. Some people moved on to other things because they found they didn't really care for tobaccos. Some people stuck with tobaccos because they like tobaccos. I myself found that I was more of a sweet vapor, although more recently I've been discovering that some of the tobaccos that have come out lately are actually really good, so I'm kind of going back and forth. I will tell you right off the bat, however, that no matter what tobacco you choose, it's not going to be like what you were smoking. My assumption when I first started out was that, and I don't know why I thought this, because frankly it would be very hard to replicate in an artificial flavor, but my assumption was that the tobacco that I got was going to taste something like a burning cigarette, and it doesn't. E-liquids that are tobacco flavored are going to taste like fresh tobacco, more like if you were to chew it than to smoke it. And that's pretty much been the rule of thumb since day one. There are a very few tobaccos that I've found that actually taste like a burning tobacco. Unfortunately, they're incredibly hard to find, and the only one I found that was really, truly accurate was in the form of a pre-made, pre-filled electronic cigar. And these things are not cheap. They're about 25 bucks a piece. They are really good, but for 25 bucks, they're not worth it. Unfortunately, I really like them. And it actually tastes like a burning Cuban. Nevertheless, assume that whatever tobacco you're going to get is going to taste like the fresh tobacco. And whether or not it tastes like your favorite brand, that's going to be up in the air. You might find ones that taste like a Marlboro or a Camel, or if you're Canadian, something like a Du Maurier or a Players or Export A or something like that. It's really up in the air as to whether or not it's going to taste something like what you're used to. For example, here's a Decang juice. It's a juice by a well-known and well-respected Chinese company called Decang. This is a particular blend I get locally called King of Tobacco. Tastes nothing like I ever smoked, but it's actually a very good tasting tobacco as far as I'm concerned. You know, it's one of the ones that I've really kind of gotten into lately, as you can tell, because I've only got about half of it left. And it's a good tobacco, but it's not the flavor of a burning tobacco. So that's probably the first thing you'll have to keep in mind when it comes to choosing a tobacco e-liquid, if indeed a tobacco e-liquid is what you're after. Not going to taste like a burning cigarette. I think that's probably the most important thing to keep in mind first when choosing e-liquids. Beyond that point, it's really up in the air as to what flavors you choose. And it's going to be entirely specific to you and what you like, because it's very subjective. Everybody likes different things. I'm a fan of fruit flavors, and I like kind of dessert vapes personally. And like I said, I've been into some of the tobaccos as well. However, we're also going to talk about nicotine strength and PG-VG ratio, which we'll get into. But first, nicotine strength. This is where it can get confusing, because a lot of people assume that the nicotine strength you choose is going to be related to the amount that you smoked or the strength of the cigarettes that you smoked. And for the most part, there isn't really a strong correlation there. If you were a 3-pack a day smoker, it's not necessarily going to be the case that you're going to want to get a 24 milligram e-liquid. Same thing if you were a smoker of like unfiltered cigarettes or Marlboro Reds or something very strong like that. It's not necessarily going to be the case that you're going to want to start at a high nicotine level. Nor is it true that you're necessarily going to vape a lot if you were a heavy smoker. Generally, when you switch to electronic cigarettes, your body is going to kind of self-regulate the amount and the strength of the nicotine that you want. Your personal preference is going to dictate the strength of the nicotine, because the strength of the nicotine is going to be entirely dependent upon the strength of the throat hit that you like. And I've mentioned this before about throat hit. The throat hit is that kind of thump in the back of your throat, right up here at the top of the chest, right around your trachea there, in your lungs, top of your throat, or bottom of your throat. And that is it's that feeling you get when you inhale a cigarette. Well, e-liquid with nicotine gives you that same kind of thump. And the stronger the nicotine level, the stronger that thump is going to be. And in many cases, the harsher it's going to be. So, really, the strength of the nicotine is going to be dictated by how much of a throat hit you want, not necessarily how much you smoked or the strength of the cigarettes that you smoked. So my recommendation is usually start at 18, because 18 milligrams is pretty much right in the middle. It's not too high, not too low, and you can adjust up and down a considerable ways from there to determine what strength you want. 18 is probably one of the more common ones, and in fact the average I think is probably around 12. And something to keep in mind as well is your nicotine level may not stay where you started. Some people might start at 18, they find that that's perfect for them, and they stay there. But they might find after a while that they're starting to get low-level headaches, a little bit of nausea, they might get heart palpitations, and all of these tend to be indications, symptoms of, early symptoms of a nicotine overdose. And that's your body telling you you need to cut down. So you may not stay at the same level. But then again, you might start at 18, love 18, and be able to stay at 18 the whole time. You might have to step it up to 24. Typically, I find anyway, is that your body is going to want to get its fill of nicotine. It's going to want to kind of top up its nicotine bar. And once it gets there, it's going to kind of tell you that it's had its fill and that's where it wants to stay, and you might have to cut down from that point. On the other hand, if you're at 18, your nicotine bar might top out at a certain level, and you're able to stay there quite satisfactorily. Some people might go up to 24 or 36 milligram, and even that might not be strong enough for some people. I've met a few people like that. So it's really all about your personal preference and what your body is going to be dictating to you. Just listen to what your body's trying to tell you, and you should be okay. That's pretty much all that needs to be said about the nicotine level. Now, about the PG-VG ratio. This is probably going to be confusing to a lot of people who don't really know what that's about. Not every vendor allows you to customize your PG and VG levels. Some do, and when you encounter that, it's going to be a little bit confusing. It basically breaks down like this. PG, or propylene glycol, is one of the main bases in e-liquid. It is a pharmaceutical grade semi-sweet liquid that is it's good for use as a flavoring base. Like if you get flavorings for baking, for candies, whatever, they are usually in a propylene glycol base. Some of them are in an alcohol base. But for the most part, most of them are probably going to be in a propylene glycol base. Propylene glycol, or PG, is a very good carrier of flavor. It really preserves the strength of the flavor that it's carrying. It also happens to be very good at delivering throat hit. And so when you have a good, like an all PG e-liquid, it's going to give you a very sharp throat hit. It's going to give you a very strong amount of flavor. However, what it isn't good at is producing vapor. Vapor, of course, is the smoke-like substance that you exhale after you take a drag. On the other hand, VG, or vegetable glycerin, which is a different form of a glycol, is very, very good at producing vapor, but it is a relatively poor carrier of flavor and throat hit. So what most people tend to do is they have a blend of PG and VG. On average, most people usually prefer a blend of about 70% PG and 30% VG. That's what I make all of my e-liquids at, because that is kind of the best compromise between the vapor production and the flavor and the throat hit. I've got my key lime pie in a cartomizer here, and as you can see, it produces a good amount of vapor. Perfectly satisfying amount of vapor, and it delivers very good flavor and throat hit. Now, you can go all PG or you can go all VG. All VGs do tend, on most cases, to have a diminished flavor and a diminished throat hit. Most vendors will try and compensate for the diminished flavor by adding more flavoring to the liquid. The throat hit is a little harder to preserve, but it can be preserved by adding a little bit of grain alcohol or something like that, which can help kind of deliver more of that original throat hit. But for the most part, most people tend to prefer a blend 70-30 or sometimes 50-50. But there are all VG juices out there as well. Who is it? Av Juice, for example, they make all VG juices for the most part, and they do have a line of 10% PG juices. But they use almost entirely vegetable glycerin. And they do a very good job of preserving the flavor and the throat hit while being an all VG liquid. Another thing, too, is VG is also much thicker than propylene glycol. And so in some cases VG is not recommended for things like cartomizers, these things here, because they don't soak up very well and they can kind of kill a cartomizer relatively early, because they gunk up on the coil, and you might get a few days out of it, but not as long as you would with a juice that has less VG in it. Again, this is going to come down to preference. It's going to come down to what you prefer. As I said, most people prefer a 70-30, but you can play around with juices that have different ratios and see how they hit you. But for the most part, it's going to be something you're going to have a particular preference for once you get into it and have explored some e-liquids to a varying degree. Another thing to talk about is the quest for that all-day vape. This is one of those semi-mythical things that you'll hear a lot of people talk about if you visit any of the e-cigarette forums. Finding that all-day vape. And that just means finding a juice that you like so much that you can vape it all day. And this can be a problem for most people because there are so many flavors out there, and it really comes down to just trying all kinds of different juices until you find one that really hits the spot for you, ticks all those boxes, gives you the throat hit you like, the flavor you like, the vapor production that you like, and really kind of satisfies you on all levels. I have a few that I can vape all day, and I've been fortunate, but I've also been at this for over 2 years, so it has taken a lot of time before I really truly found those all-day vapes. And prior to that, I was really kind of switching between, you know, half a dozen juices at a time, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, throughout the day, until I finally found, you know, some juices that I can vape all day. My key lime pie happens to be one of them. That's why I talk about it so much in my reviews, and that's simply because it's something that is my all-day vape, and it's something that you're only going to find through exploration, and that exploration can take quite a while, and it can take exploring different vendors, different brands of juice, even trying to make your own if you're really up for it, but that's not going to be the subject of any of these videos here, I don't think, because that's kind of an advanced topic, and it's not something that I would recommend anybody try until they're really comfortable with, you know, vaping and electronic cigarettes and have moved on to the advanced levels. But it's something you need to be prepared for. It's something you need to really kind of understand that this is something that's not going to happen overnight, unless you get really lucky and happen to find that one juice right off the bat that you really like. But also keep in mind too that as you vape, as you get off of cigarettes, as your taste buds change, so too will your taste in juice. And this is something that's going to happen over the course of several months. And you could find a juice that's really awesome one day, but, you know, as your taste buds change and recover and liven up, you're going to find maybe it's not satisfying you down the road, and you're going to suddenly realize, hey, this other flavor that I didn't really like before, I suddenly like a lot. Or maybe you'll find a new juice that really hits the spot far more than anything else did. So that's pretty much all there is to say about e-liquid. Again, it's not very much help for me to tell you, well, you're just going to have to try. But unfortunately, because it's such a subjective topic, that really is the answer. It's something you're going to have to explore and try and just figure out what really hits you. I do want to say, though, try to keep in mind that not all flavors that you like in reality as actual food items necessarily work as vapes. One such thing are what we call savory vapes, and we have a saying in the e-cigarette world, friends don't let friends vape savory. And the reason for that is because while you might like flavors like bacon or back ribs or barbecue chicken, they don't work as vapes. They really don't. Even if they taste pretty close to what they're supposed to be, there seems to just be something very disturbing about inhaling something that you would normally eat. Specifically when it comes to savories. Fruits and candies and desserts, that's a different topic. Even, you know, drinks and things like that, for whatever reason, they work as vapes. Savories they don't. If you see a bacon or a chicken or a beef or something like that, consider it a novelty and something to do on a dare, but not something you're probably going to want to try deliberately. Now, the last topic I want to talk about are the attachments. Generally speaking, there are three primary ways to consume your e-liquid. You've got your cartomizers, that's things that look like this here. You have your clearomizers, which in many cases look something like this. This is what they call a Stardust or an EgoVision clearomizer, if it's one made by Vision. Or there are atomizers. And I'm just going to talk briefly about the differences between the two. Cartomizers are probably the most common ways to consume your e-liquid. They are very simple devices. I explained this in a previous video, but it's a combination of an atomizer and a cartridge in one little device like this. And really all it is if I can get a, here we go, I'll just take this off here, and there we go. All it really is, if you look inside, down that center tube is the coil. You can't see it because it's way down there. But you've got this polyfilm material on the outside that you fill with e-liquid. It soaks in there, and it surrounds the cartomizer. And you've got the air tube in the center to draw air from the bottom of the cartomizer. Clearomizers are essentially tank systems, and you drip liquid in here until it's full up to whatever point its maximum capacity is. And it has wicks that stick out from a main cup that contains the wick. And basically you tip periodically to charge the wicks up at the top, and you vape on them. The only difference between these is that the liquid is not always surrounding the coil. It uses wicks instead to pull juice up from the bottom up to this coil up here, and that's not always very efficient, so sometimes you have to do that tip thing while it's on your device so that the liquid can get right up to the top of the wicks and be drawn into the coil. Now, atomizers these days are really only used for one purpose, and that is dripping. Dripping is something I don't generally do on a personal level. I usually drip when I'm doing reviews because it's a great way to sample juices without having to sacrifice a whole cartomizer. And really all it is you take this atomizer device here, you use a drip tip. Drip tips come in all different shapes and sizes. This happens to be something like a Ming or a vase type. And all you do is you attach it to a device, which I shall do right now, like so. This is an Ego C twist I'm attaching it to. Put it on your device. And all you do is you take some liquid, and I will take my aforementioned King of Tobacco here, and I will drip some directly down the drip tip, like so. I'll usually blow down the drip tip so that I make sure that none of the juice is stuck up here and kind of held on there by capillary attraction. There we go. It's blown into the atomizer. Now that it's all down here in this atomizer, I can vape. Typically, I will fill it with about 7 or 8 drops to start with on a very clean atomizer, and then I'll vape. I might get half a dozen puffs, maybe 10 puffs, and then it will start to taste dry, and at that point I know it's time to drip more liquid in, at which point I'll put in another 3 drops maybe, which will give me another 5 or 6 puffs or whatever, and I'll just repeat the process as I go. Some people don't mind dripping. It's something they like to do at home. You know, they just use this method just to drip right into the atomizer and vape that way. And the reason some people prefer it is because atomizers tend to be probably the cleanest and purest way to experience your e-liquids, because they produce clean flavor and they produce lots of it. They produce good throat hit, better usually in most cases than most clearomizers and most cartomizers. And it is a good way of dripping. I find it's a little bit too high maintenance personally, but that's how a lot of people prefer to do it, and that's how I do it when I do my reviews. And it does taste good. So those are the 3 main methods. there are advantages and disadvantages to each of those types. Once again, and unfortunately this is a mantra that is recurring throughout the electronic cigarette world, it's going to come down to personal preference, what you like to do, when and where. Cartomizers, I find, are the most convenient. They're disposable. You fill them up. When they get dry, you top it up, and eventually, maybe 4, 5, 6 days later, maybe longer, maybe shorter, they're going to start to fade. The flavor is going to start to fade, and it's not going to produce as good vapor, as good throat hit, and that's when you know it's kind of starting to die, and eventually you'll have to chuck it and open up a new one and fill that with liquid and use that. It is disposable, so it does produce more waste, but on the other hand, it's more convenient, and it's very much easier to use on the go. You just fill it and you go, and you're good for, you know, a few hours, usually with a cartomizer, before you have to refill it. The clearomizers, like I said, they're negative, if you can call it that, is the fact that you have to tip them periodically to recharge the tops of the wicks and get them vaping good again. But they also tend to produce pretty good flavor as well, assuming you get a good one, of course. There are some that aren't so good out there, and some that are. It's just another situation where, you know, there's all kinds of brands and different names. That's another topic entirely. But that pretty much covers everything I wanted to talk about when it comes to choosing what's right for you. Unfortunately, it doesn't really do a whole lot to tell you what to buy. Personally, for me, you know, I think if you can go for it, if you don't mind a larger form factor, and if you don't mind something that's going to be a little bit more bulky than average, I would recommend something like, you know, the Ego C Twist. It is available in a range of sizes from 650 milliamp hours up to 1,000, and I find that they're great because they also are variable voltage, and you can dial in your preferred voltage at the top, which really just regulates the temperature of the vape, and the temperature of the vape can regulate how much flavor you get, how much throat hit you get. But of course, if you set it too high, then it's going to be kind of burnt tasting, and it may not come across very, very good. You set it too low, it can be a little bit weak tasting. But the fact that you can dial in your preference, regardless almost of what kind of cartomizer you have attached to it, is pretty much the bonus here. That's what really makes these batteries as good as they are, as popular as they are. They're very reliable, they're easy to use, nothing fancy about them, they just work. And I use it pretty much constantly myself, even though I have all kinds of devices, some of which are even more powerful. This is one of those devices that tends to go with me pretty much everywhere I go. Everything else is pretty much going to be up to you as to what you want to try. That's pretty much the mantra when it comes to the electronic cigarette world, is just try stuff. Because it is a big world. There's a lot of devices, a lot of different things to try, and you know, it's really going to come down to a matter of finding a device you're comfortable with, a device you like, whether you like cartomizers or clearomizers, or whether you like dripping, or maybe have a variety of them. And of course, finding your juice. It will take a while for most people. You might luck out and get devices that you really like and juice that you really like. But for the most part, it is going to be a situation where you're going to have to spend some time exploring and spend some money exploring different juices, different cartomizers, different clearomizers, different batteries, and so on. It's just the nature of the beast, I'm afraid. But I hope this helps you maybe make a more informed decision as to what you want to start out with electronic cigarettes. So, that's pretty much all I have for this video. I am going to be doing some more videos on tutorials, on primers, things like dispelling myths about electronic cigarettes, talking more about maybe at some point talking about mods, things like that, but just stay tuned and you'll see. In the meantime, I have been Eric for Vast Vapor, and happy vaping.